I want you to do the opposite of this as well. And again, when we talk about positive space versus negative space, positive space is going to be your subject, right? This time around, I'm going to concern myself much more with the darker portion of what I see here. So this step stool, I'm going to do some gesturing to try to get these correct angles and things. I'm not focused so much now on the negative as I am the positive. Now, when I start to ink in my negative, because in this case, I want you to leave the positive white. Kind of have to think backwards on this. When I start to ink in my negative, if I see anything incorrect with the way that I've drawn my positive space, that's when I start to make those corrections. That's when I'm going to like, okay, maybe I didn't get this triangle to work very well. So maybe I'll ink that in so it looks a little bit more close to what I have here. So I'm just going to focus in on one area for this. You'll probably find that one of these methods works better for you than the other. I happen to be, just kind of the way I think, the way I process information, I happen to prefer the negative space evaluation more. It helps me a lot more with understanding that relationship of the two sort of puzzle pieces, as it were. I'm just going to focus on one area, like the top two. I'm going to gesture really lightly what I see here. Kind of come across here. So I'm using a good deal of kind of loose perspectival drawing. Now, it's not something we've really dealt with yet. We will pretty heavily in the future. But I'm looking at parallel aspects in here, and I'm looking at how these areas in between sort of have that same parallelism. So I've got like a plane here, got another plane below, and they're basically the same parallelism happening. But I have to make sure that when I'm doing this, that I'm looking at my angles, and I'll trace those out in space to make sure that I have those correct. Now I'm just worrying about the big stuff for now. Then I'm going to go in and then I start looking at the more complicated elements here. So I'm going to pencil sight a little bit to make sure I have the same amount of space, and it does have the same amount of space between each step here. So I see that that's that wide. So I'm going to come down here and say, okay, well, that's where the next one should be. So in measuring that pencil sighting is absolutely essential. And again, this is just a rough draw for now. I'm going to clean it up as we move along. I'm going to go ahead and get that back leg happening there. Looks like that back leg kind of goes in between these two. There's a little connection happening in there. Bring that back. Yeah, I've got that angle looking pretty good there. Okay. So I have a pretty good start to this. I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start looking at the stuff that's in between here. So I've got a leg going back this way. And again, I'm thinking more about the subject here. So when I talk about this, I'm talking about like what I see and what it represents. So these legs that go back, these legs that attach at certain areas. Got another one sort of coming out this way. It looks like it's kind of going off like that. And what I really want you to do when we're doing this exercise is just pay attention to the way you're processing information. If it's more difficult for you to do one way than the other, just remember that, because you're probably not going to want to employ the negative if you see more positively, just inherently, and vice versa, right? So I find this to be a little more challenging just because I like the negative space better. So I feel like I have a pretty good thing going on here. We'll see. It's going to get more complex when I start to blacken in my negative space. Okay. Get like a little bit of dimension here, because it's definitely not flat like that, right? And kind of sketch out some of the planes that I see happening in here. So I am more concerned now with the stuff that I see in an objective way. just add a little bit of girth to these boys here. Get that thickness happening. Again, it's loose, but I'll be cleaning it up here. Okay. So now I'm seeing it at these junctions here. I have kind of like looks like a little kind of spacer happening there. So I'm kind of using the framework that I've already built in here to just push those out a little bit. And you'll see that I have to change this a little bit as I go along. It was just kind of a reference or guideline for me in the beginning. There we go. Okay. So that means that I probably need to bring this out further out here maybe and use this. I'm actually kind of looking at a lot of the negative spacing between these to help me with what this looks like. Because I just think better that way, right? Or you'll use what works best for you. So you'll have one of each of these drawings, and I don't want you to use the same subject. You're going to find that whatever subject you start with the negative space, you're probably going to be using the same tactics and skills on that, regardless of whether or not you're trying to do the positive space aspect of it. So it's important to just have a couple of different subjects so that you can start fresh with a new skill. Now with this one, there's going to be a lot of black in this. So I definitely will only be doing like the contours with Sharpie, and then I'll be moving into using ink wash to fill the rest of it. So I'm just kind of cleaning up and perfecting things. And of course, this doesn't work for everything, but it can be helpful in a lot of different situations. Like, I actually use this a lot with figure drawing when I have an intensely foreshortened pose happening, because with foreshortening, it's really difficult to see how different anatomical portions of the body interact, because essentially with foreshortening you have a lot of lumping of shapes one on top of the other, and so it becomes more of an analytical thing than it is about spatial understanding. Okay, so now I go about blackening in my negative space so that my positive space is what represents the white of the paper. So see, as I go through here, I'm perfecting and cleaning up at this point. And I don't like to get rid of my pencil until I'm pretty certain that I'm confident about my contours, because then I can go in there and I can carve things away, I can change the way it looks. It's kind of difficult because it's black on black, but I think I see what's going on there. So another way that you can go about doing this, instead of maybe using a window, would be to put like a bright light behind your stuff. But you don't want it so bright that it's going to be difficult for you to look at for a long time, right? So like with my other drawing, I'm just going to work on a section here to give you a good idea of what it needs to look like. Because really the work and the practice with this technique is most important in the beginning stages of laying information out and then modifying contours as you're working. So I'm just going to kind of shade away from these a little bit, just so that when I hit them with India ink, I see that I have nice clean edges and contours happening here. Looks like this kind of sticks out a little bit. Looks like I had that right. That's good. Another great way to do this is to project an intense light upon your subject and look at the shadow behind it and evaluate the shadow. That's going to help you to stay away from trying to think about this more symbolically, because you might get fatigued brain-wise and go, okay, well, I know what a stool looks like, I'll just simplify it. We don't want that at all. We want to be able to spend the time that we need in analysis to really pay attention to what's going on with our subject so that we can knock it down objectively and get a good rendering going on. So I think I'll go to about this point here and then just kind of start shading stuff in. And of course, you know, I want you to have clean white space in the subject. So when you're done with all this, you're going to want to go in with a vinyl eraser and clean all of this graphite out so that it's just ink on paper. And again, pay attention to the way that you experience this as you go. Because the whole thing about the way I teach this class is you try all these techniques out, and then after midterm, you begin to apply these techniques. And you're only going to use the ones that work for you. I'm not going to force you to use stuff that doesn't work for you. It doesn't make sense to do that, in my mind. Okay. I think that's a pretty good representation of where I'm going with this. So then I'll move on, clean everything else up, blacken all of this non-image or negative space out completely.